Chapter 18 Yaxer. The flight from RAF Briars Norton into Guatemala had been pretty rough. The jet streams of early December had made the flight really bumpy. At least it wasn't hurricane season anymore. James had also managed to borrow a couple of Land Rovers to use once they were in the jungle. The plan was that they would be airdropped into part of the rainforest to the north of the ruins, and then cut their way through the jungle to the temple at Yaxer. The Guatemalan military had agreed to allow their flight access on the grounds that they were an archaeological team with heavy equipment that could only be flown into the jungle surrounding the temple complex. The explanation was accepted because Devon was with them and she had done this sort of thing several times before. "See, I told you she'd come in useful," James said as he finished talking to ground control over the headset. Devon had also arranged for a guide to meet them at the drop point and lead them into the jungle to the great temple at Yaxer. "I wonder if this Mayan prophecy will come true," Ollie said. "It's coming up to that time of year." "Oh, please don't tell me you buy into all that mumbo-jumbo, do you?" Gaz scoffed. "Well, it could happen." "Actually, there are no grounds for it. The end of the 13th Bacton, which corresponds with the 21st of December, is just the end of a whole cycle. For the Maya, this would have been cause for a huge celebration. It was the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new one. There's no evidence to suggest they would have expected the world to end," Devon said. "The whole disaster myth has arisen from modern society's fears. These have been exaggerated by our love for disaster movies and our fears of an uncertain future," she added. "Well, that's good to know. Are we not trying to prevent a disaster?" Ollie asked. "In a sense, yes, but the glove is a long way from orchestrating that," Gaz replied. "The glove? Who or what are they?" Devon asked, as her curiosity at this slip of information was sparked. "I guess you hadn't told her about them yet," Gaz said, as he passed an apologetic look to Chris. "No, I thought it was better not for the time being. Well, I suppose I'm going to have to explain now." "Maybe once we're on the ground," Chris replied, ignoring the expression on Devon's face that clearly showed that she really wanted an explanation now. Ollie tried to distract her attention by carrying on his line of questioning regarding the Mayan myth. "So, what you're really saying is that instead of this being the end, the myth could sort of be right, and that this is just the start of a cycle that is the beginning of the end?" "I guess if you're rather pessimistic, it could be the start of something. It could just be the start of something new," Devon replied. "I wouldn't worry about it too much if I were you. I believe that people are far better off in the present than worrying about what might or might not happen in the future. At the moment, I'm far more concerned about jumping out of this aeroplane in about 10 minutes. "Oh, you'll love it. Such a rush," Gaz said, with a massive grin on his face. He couldn't wait for that feeling as the air rushed past his face. "We have a go. Everybody ready?" Chris said, as he made his way along the plane towards the tail. The air rushed in as he dropped to the tail. The noise of the swirling wind was deafening. He had to shout as loud as he could to be heard, grabbing hold of some old webbing straps to prevent himself being sucked out. Removing the clamps from the Land Rovers, he released the first chute. The tiny chute shot out of the tail of a plane like a horse bolting from the stalls. As the resistance around the chute grew, it pulled out another, until finally there was enough drag to create and cause the first of the two Land Rovers to gradually slide out of the plane. This was quickly followed by the second. As soon as the Land Rovers were away, they followed. Rachel and Devon, who were new to parachuting, were paired with Ollie and Gaz, the two most experienced skydivers. To anybody watching from the ground below, it would have seemed as if Guatemala was under invasion as the huge white canopies drifted down through the clear blue skies towards the ground. The vehicles floated down and landed with a jolt as they met the solid ground, followed closely by the team. The pilot circled the plane, banking sharply around to make sure they had all landed safely before heading off towards whichever airbase had been arranged for him to refuel at. They'd landed in a clearing in the jungle. Devon had been clinging so tightly to the webbing straps that her fingers had cramped up. She was probably the only one who'd been totally terrified on the way down and needed a bit of time to sit down and recover her nerves after she had unclipped from Gaz. Gaz, Ollie and James set about detaching the large chutes from the Land Rovers, carefully packing them away. They were planning on using them as tents during the expedition. Their guide met them about 20 minutes after they'd landed. He was called Lome and was a direct descendant of the Maya. His vast knowledge of the jungle was second to none. He told them he would take them on the shortest possible route to the temple, but warned them that the going would be very arduous, even with the Land Rovers. Lome was right. The going was hard. Picking their way through the undergrowth of the jungle, they eventually found a small clearing just before dusk. They set about making camp for the night and would continue on to the ancient ruins at first light the next day. According to Lome, the ruins that best fit the map's description are about half a day's drive from here, depending slightly on how much the trail has been engulfed by the rainforest since the end of the rains, Devon said to Chris, who was busy lighting the fire he had built to keep them warm during the night. You said the one that best fits the description? How accurate is that? Pretty accurate. It describes a temple complex that overlooks a lake. The lake has a series of islands upon which another temple has been constructed. This was a sacred burial ground. To the best of his knowledge, Yaxra and Tapotoxte are the sites that best fit this description. They're not as well known as El Mirador or Tikal, but then it would be unlikely that they would have hidden something of such great importance in the most prestigious cities. Well, Professor, I have the utmost faith in you, he said, smiling at her. Ollie and Gaz were attempting to erect the tents. Man, you can't put that there. We're not making teepees, Ollie started to say. Oh, but I thought you would need one for all your squaws, Gaz replied. What squaws? The ones that you always claim you're going to get with on these trips, and always finish up as lone wolf? Gaz retorted with a cheeky laugh. Well, better that than angry bear, replied Ollie, with a slightly mischievous twinkle in his eyes. What do you mean by that? Gaz's question was answered by Ollie tugging on one of the ropes holding up the canopy over his head. The entire parachute dropped down onto the unsuspecting head of Gaz, totally engulfing him. Ollie burst out into hysterics as Gaz struggled to get out of the mass of material. Ollie's laughter just enraged him more. He really was quite tangled inside the nylon fabric. You just wait until I get out of here, then I'll show you what an angry bear looks like, growled Gaz from underneath the parachute. I think I've a pretty good idea already, but let me know and I'll take a picture. Man, this is the best prank I've played on you for ages. Ollie tried to sound serious, but couldn't manage to keep a straight face. The sight of his friend blindly fumbling around in the white fabric was just too funny. That was until he caught sight of a huge snake slithering towards the canopy. Gaz, stop moving. Stay very still. There's a snake coming towards you. Yeah, very funny. I'm not falling for that one. I'm not joking. Don't move. Not funny. Not gonna bite all. No, but I think it will. Dude, I hate snakes. Get it away from me before I freak out. Gaz, suddenly realising the gravity of the situation, was now very much less angry and rather more afraid of what be about to happen. Get it away from me. Stay very still. That's easier said than done when you're about to become dinner, Gaz said through gritted teeth. A loud crack echoed through the trees. James had also seen the snake and had grabbed a rifle from the back of one of the Land Rovers. He hadn't wasted any time in loading it, taking aim, and shooting the snake dead before it could strike. When you two have quite finished fooling around, can we get these tents up? It's starting to get dark, and I'd quite like some sort of roof over my head tonight, he said, slightly irritated with the two young men. Oh, all right, it was only a bit of fun, Ollie replied. For you, maybe, not for me. You better sleep with one eye open. I'll get my revenge at some point, Gaz exclaimed as he finally emerged from under the mass of material. Devon was pondering over a line in the text on the map. She knew it was the key to revealing the book the Maya had hidden, yet it made no sense to her. When the heavens align, the truth will become visible. You seem deep in thought, Chris said as he walked over to where she was sitting beside the fire. Anything I can help with? This line's been bugging me. I'm not sure what it means, she said with a deep sigh. Ah, yes, I saw that in your translations. I have an idea what it might be referring to, but I won't know if I'm correct until we get to the temple, he replied in another one of his mysterious phrases. And I suppose you're not going to fill me in? She flatly asked. Well, not yet, anyway. I wouldn't want it to be an anticlimax, he replied with an annoyingly knowing grin before walking off to help the others finish putting up the tents. Devon thumped her hand against the log she was sitting on. That man was infuriating, always dropping hints to pique her curiosity, and yet never giving away the whole picture. He was such a tease. It drove her crazy. She wished she could get inside his head just once to know what he was thinking. Lomai stood on the edge of the clearing, observing his new companions. He was keeping watch for the pumas and jaguars that inhabited this part of the jungle. He was certain that the big cat would have sensed the presence of something new in their playground, and would soon come to investigate the strange new smells they had caught on the air. It would be advisable to keep the fire burning all night, and to keep watch, just in case any of the jungle predators come to investigate, Senor. James took Lomai's advice and paired the group up. They would take 2-hour shifts at keeping watch during the night whilst the rest of the group slept. Chris and Lomai took the first watch. The rest turned in rather early so that they would be fresh in the morning. Chris hoped to arrive at the temple before midday, which would mean starting out early. During their watch, Chris talked to Lomai about his ancestors. He wanted to understand the Maya better. He hoped that he would gain some insight into their knowledge of the stars. They were, after all, the closest to the lords of time and space. Thousands of years ago, they had worked out exactly how long it took for the Earth to orbit around the Sun, something that modern civilizations only achieved using sophisticated electronic devices. This sort of accomplishment fascinated him. The Maya were the first culture to use the figure 0 within their counting system. They truly were light years ahead of other civilizations of the period. Apart from all the usual trekking equipment, Chris had also brought with him the artefacts that he had retrieved from the crypt at Martinstow. He had examined them briefly back in the privacy of one of the studies at the house. He believed that they held the key, or rather were the key, to unlocking the book in the Mayan temple. He had originally thought that there were 3 separate pieces, but now he understood that they were in fact part of the same mechanism. Although try as he might, he couldn't get them to fit together. Coming to the conclusion that there was something else required to do this, which he hoped was in the temple, he left them wrapped in a linen cloth and stowed them in his rucksack. Chris hoped that it was the only set, so that even if Norwood beat them to the temple, he would not be able to find the book. That was, if he even knew the exact location, which more than likely he did. Chris was hedging his bets that Norwood would be delayed travelling up from Panama, arriving after they had long departed. James tossed and turned in his sleeping bag. His dreams were worse than ever. He dreamt of thousands of tormented souls crying out as one, in great pain. Many more were dead or dying, wiped out by an unknown force. He could feel their pain. He felt like a bystander, powerless to help. Unlike the others, these dreams had images that he had not actually witnessed. These images were something new, something still to come, perhaps. He woke several times during the night, with cold beads of sweat rolling down his face. Maybe it was just the humidity, or just the way his subconscious grieved for the loss of Jack. Either way, he was definitely not going to get much more sleep tonight. In the end, he just lay there, staring at the roof of the makeshift tent, waiting until it was his turn to take watch. Apart from his restless sleep, the night passed relatively quietly. The fire that had been kept well stocked had done its job. The wild cats never came near the camp to investigate. Chris and the group left early. The humidity in the forest was worse than it had ever been at this time of year. The sun beat down on the lush green vegetation. Lomai had mentioned the wet season had been one of the wettest on record, hence why the humidity was now much higher than usual for that time of year. The Land Rovers had to stop several times in order for people to get out and chop away branches and other vegetation that had begun to grow over the tracks they were following. At one point, because the ground was so soft, part of the trail fell away down the hillside, almost taking one of the Land Rovers with it. Luckily for the occupants of the Land Rovers abrupt sideways slide down the slope came to a halt up against the trunk of a young tree. Had the Land Rover continued down the hill, it would have certainly toppled and then rolled, more likely than not killing all those seated inside. They had to act fast to winch the vehicle up onto the trail. The tree that had initially checked the sideways movement would not hold fast for long. It was not much more than a sapling, so the root system was not fully established in the fertile soil, and the landslide had now exposed part of what little roots it had developed. Jesus, that was close. Lucky this little fella's got roots, otherwise we'd have been goners. Gaz, take the winch cable to that tree on the far side. Chris and I'll run a rope from the running board to the tree on the far side, James said as he took charge of the situation. The setup allowed them to gradually drag the Land Rover back onto the main tracks by pivoting on the rope. After a few more delays to hack away more of the dense undergrowth from the trail, they finally reached the ancient site just after noon. The temple at Yaksa rose up like a mountain from the jungle floor. The great stone pyramid was desperately fighting a losing battle with the encroaching forest. It was gradually being smothered by the jungle, soon to disappear forever, back beneath the unwavering advance of the forest, just like the civilization that had created it. Many of the complex's buildings lay in ruin. The locals had robbed the stone over the years to make stone walls to keep in livestock, so the city had lost much of its grandeur. Nevertheless, the temple, unlike the rest of the site, had remained virtually intact. Whether this was because the locals had left it alone, fearing that they would incur the wrath of the ancient gods by disturbing it, or that they just not needed any more stone, was a mystery. Whatever the reason, it had remained more or less complete, eroded only by the passage of time. At the entrance to the temple stood two huge jaguar heads carved in limestone. They represented the guardians of the temple. The team passed between them and on up the temple steps towards a doorway, the entrance to Yaxa's inner sanctum. The darkness inside the temple enveloped them as they entered, forcing them to negotiate the passages by torchlight. The light from the torches cast long shadows on the walls as they followed the ancient stoneworks. Devon pointed out many friezes carved into the limestone walls. These told the story of the Maya. One in particular caught her attention. It was part of the Popol Vuh, the Book of the People. This frieze depicted part of the Mayan creation story, how the gods had first made men from mud and wood, but they lacked speech, souls and intellect, and so the gods destroyed them. It was only when men were made from corn that they were allowed to flourish. The friezes began to change as they ventured further into the temple. The carvings began to focus on the stars, the movements of the sun, moon, and a few of the other planets, whilst others showed Mayan numerals making up parts of the long count calendar. This was made up of Bacton, or cycles, each Bacton consisting of 144,000 days. It was from one of these friezes that the Mayan myth of the end of the world had originally been generated, the end of the 13th Bactum. In this part of the temple, the first 12 Bacton had been carved on either side of a great stone panel that protruded out from the rest of the wall by about a foot or so. There were 6 Bacton on each side. In the centre of the huge panel was the 13th. More care had been taken to construct this one, as if it was more significant than the others. Devon carefully studied the carving with the help of Lomai, who was far more versed in the language of the Maya than she was. The carving talked of a hand and a ceremony, that the end of the 13th Bactrum would be a cause for great celebration. Much of the rest of the frieze was illegible, as it had fallen apart over time. Lomai, what does this section say? I can't seem to make sense of it, Devon asked the old Mayan guide. Let me see. Very strange. It's gibberish. The numerals are in the wrong order. This is very unlike the Maya. They were very precise about such things. It is unusual to find a mistake on a carving, something that would have been meticulously planned out before creating it, the guide said. Then it must be deliberate. Maybe a puzzle to solve? Chris suggested. Perhaps, replied the guide, nodding his head. This should read 12, 19, 19, 17, 19, but instead reads 19, 19, 17, 19, 12. Maybe they can be moved, he suggested. Chris tried to slide them, but the first few he tried would not budge. It was only when he came to try the number 12 that something happened. Instead of the glyph sliding across, as he touched it, it sank back into the panel. Aha! See, they must be pressed, Lomai explained. Chris completed the sequence as Lomai directed, and once the last glyph sank into place, a small panel slid open to reveal part of an ancient mechanism made up of many brass wheels and cogs. I know what this is, Chris said. "I've some similar parts in my rucksack from the crypt." He quickly set down his sack and rummaged around inside it for the artifacts. He carefully unwrapped them, setting each one down on the ground in front of the frieze as he moved on to the next. "They never quite seemed to fit together when I was examining them at Martinstow. Now I know why. They needed the parts here to complete the mechanism," Chris explained, as he began to fit them onto the parts in the frieze. "Is this your big climax?" Devon asked, as she watched him try to fit the parts together. She let out a gasp as the last piece was set in place. "I've seen one of these before, in a museum in Athens, or at least something that looks very similar. They called it the Antikythera mechanism, the world's first computer of sorts. But that was Greek, and if I'm not mistaken, the symbols on this are Sumerian." She said, still staring at the device in disbelief. "The Greeks were not the only ones to understand the movements of the planets. I think this should now shed some light on that passage you were struggling with, the one about the alignment of the heavens. At the moment, all the planets are in different positions, but if I wind this knob, they start to rotate around the sun," Chris said as he began to turn the knob at the side of the mechanism. The tiny spheres representing the planets gradually started to resolve around the central dial. "Yes, I understand now. You need to rotate them until they all line up," Devon replied. "Precisely. Many cultures believe that when all the planets were in alignment, great things would happen," he replied excitedly as he continued to wind the mechanism on. The anticipation amongst the group was growing as the planets moved ever closer to completing the alignment. They were expecting something amazing to happen. There was no sound inside the temple. Everyone was holding his or her breath as the last planet slid into alignment. Silence. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken by Gaz. "That was a bit of an anticlimax. I was expecting fireworks, at least." "I don't understand. This can't be what's supposed to happen," Chris said, frustrated that his big show had lacked a dramatic ending. "Perhaps it's broken. It's not been used for such a long time. Part of the mechanism may have simply perished or corroded," Devon suggested. She too had been expecting a little more than nothing. "No, I don't think so. It's so well protected. The craftsman obviously intended it to last. The only thing I can think is that the alignment is wrong," Chris said in a rather dejected voice. He could see from the glyphs on the outer dial that the combinations were almost endless. Lamai had been quiet for some time. He'd been studying the mechanism. Its design was alien to him, and yet he understood its principle. "Senor, if I may, I think you have the wrong eclipse. If the alignment is of great significance, then I believe that the Maya would have found a solar eclipse far more important. You've currently got a lunar eclipse, if I'm reading this correctly," the guide suggested. "Lamai, you're a genius. Of course, that makes perfect sense. I wish I'd thought of that. Thank you," Chris exclaimed in relief. Chris quickly realigned the small spheres. This time as the moon swung round to block the sun, the temple wall began to shake violently, and then part of it fell away, engulfing them in a cloud of dust. As the dust began to settle, they all peered through the hole where the wall had once stood. Through the gloom, they could make out a small square room with a rectangular pedestal at its centre. The pedestal was built upon 4 square platforms. Upon the pedestal lay what resembled a book, covered in thick layers of time. "Now that's what I call fireworks," said Gaz. "Can we go home now?" "Not just yet. It may be booby-trapped," Chris replied. "I think that's unlikely. The mire would have relied on the mechanism to keep it safe, Devon said. Well, I'm not going to take any chances, Chris replied. He cautiously made his way towards the pedestal, watching the floor for any signs of loose stones that might trigger traps. There was no sign of any. Taking several deep breaths, he built up the courage to remove the book from its resting place. He had seen too many relic hunter type movies and was thinking that as he lifted the book, something nasty would happen. Devon was in fact proved to be correct. As he snatched the book up from the pedestal, nothing happened. There were no traps.